for a while, players and gamers were fine with it because there was no actual advantage. Once you give them advantages in-game, for whatever reason, that's the problem, wakes them up to it. And once the outrage from that gets loud enough, now all of a sudden politicians are paying attention.
This week's been interesting because the discussion surrounding loot boxes has resurfaced with Rocket League and the ESA announcing, console manufacturers now needing to disclose the odds and the chances of what you'll get or whatever. This has been a topic of discussion, especially for us, around the office even, just like how thorny and how tricky this is at this particular moment. I'm curious to just pick your brain and hear what you think about everything going on recently.
It's really cool because I think we're finally just, seeing some actual traction being gained here. At least here in the United States, we've been looking into things fine, while other countries in Europe or other places have actually done stuff. Now we're finally getting to a point where at least we're seeing, not necessarily, regulations from the government, but we're seeing companies at least making the decision, right, to either adjust to the way that their payment models are going to work, try and get ahead of whatever regulation there might be and say, hey, we're actually going to disclose odds, right? Because the ESA thing, that's still, it's not necessarily a mandate, right?
Right.
It's still, the three major companies, the big three, deciding, hey, we're actually going to make it so, if you're on our consoles or things like that, we have to disclose,
right.
Which is something that other countries have been doing plenty, right? One of the big things that was such an important part of regulation for mobile games was the fact that, for a while, China had beat the United States and other countries to making it a requirement to disclose odds. And because of that, a lot of things that were going to international markets were already disclosing odds anyway. Fire Emblem Heroes was disclosing odds right from the start, essentially. And part of that is because there was already pressure from other countries and around the world to actually disclose these things, whatever's happening, in the East or whatever. And now I think we're finally seeing companies realize that that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah.
And they might as well not fight all of it,
right.
kind of go with a little bit more.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating that you mentioned Fire Emblem Heroes, for example, and Animal Crossing Pocket Camp at the end of August. Actually, it's going to be officially removed from the whatever mobile app stores in Belgium in particular. They added something in their laws that strictly forbid that kind of monetization system, which is really fascinating. And you brought up the ESA, which I also, again, find pretty interesting because that's kind of how they got their start, right? Like in the 90s, there was this whole discussion around, video game violence and, trying to ban, or the discussion around banning video game violence. And unfortunately, that discussion seems to be bubbling up again for a whole other sort of reason. But that's kind of how they got their start, as this lobbying group that also kind of self-regulates and is there to sort of prevent any major drastic action like banning a certain thing or whatever.
Did you check the rating? Rating? Yeah, it's simple. Always check the rating symbol on the front and read the content descriptor on the back.
In relation to that, there was a proposed bill by this Republican senator from Missouri, I believe, that has this language in there that kind of makes it sound like, yeah, if assuming this thing got passed or whatever, it would pretty much ban microtransactions altogether in any kind of game. So this move by the ESA seems like this preventative measure, this thing that they can sort of do now before it gets to a certain place. You actually wrote a piece in October of 2017 on loot boxes and how they're pretty predatory. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It doesn't seem like this controversial thing to say anymore, right? By now we've all experienced it in one form or another, whether it's Overwatch or even Apex Legends or whatever. And some companies are also getting ahead of it by, implementing their own different monetization systems, like Fortnite or now Rocket League changing their whole system to match Epic's sort of style of how they do things. So I'm curious how you feel about that, in terms of companies either getting ahead of it or should we actually, take more drastic action?
I think for a long time we had considered this notion that if it was cosmetic only, then that's fine. And the thing that really woke up at least players, right, people who care about the way that a game plays, was Battlefront 2, where not only was that very obvious because it was baked into the structure of that game, hey, either you have to take a long time to get these star cards that give you abilities and actual boosts to your play, or you can just buy a bunch of loot crates and have the better ones right away. You know, I wish we had had a discussion earlier about these things when it was mostly cosmetic only, but the fact that at least that woke up people to kind of what was happening, and this idea that especially if there was, you know, a competitive advantage to getting, you know, loot crates or items from loot crates, that would actually encourage people to buy them. And then once you're buying them, the way that they're structured, the way that the money is structured is like, oh, you'll buy 10, but then you only have so many, you know, magic crystals or whatever the heck to get more, so you have to buy $3.99 or whatever. And I think that really woke people up to the way that the structure was working and how it was working against them. And I think, you know, you mentioned the start of the ESA working as a lobbyist group, which it's important to remember that the ESA is representing corporations, not representing like gamers or workers or things like that. But the reason that it took people so long, especially lawmakers, you're mentioning the bill from Josh Hawley, who Jason interviewed for our site. The reason it took lawmakers so long to figure that out compared to something like video game violence is because video game violence is something you can see and you have a very visceral reaction to right away. So you have people, you know, in the 90s, Tipper Gore era, putting, you know, parental advisory stuff on CDs at the time, and they say, hey, we can do this to games too. We can have something like Doom or Mortal Kombat, and we can see, you know, blood and gore and the things that might affect our kids. The thing that you can't see, especially once monetization in games, you know, starts to take off a little bit after DLC and expansions, is actually the economics of this and what actually tempts people. And what tempts people is, you know, actual reward, cool stuff, but underneath that it's structured so that once you start, there's a compulsion to keep on going and going and going. And I think for a while, it took people a long time to realize how much that really is like gambling. It freaking sucks that the way that we get stuff done, at least in the United States, is by framing everything as a moral issue. But I think that's how you get people's attention in this case, right? The reason that Hawley does that, and remember, Hawley's a Republican, right? So in theory, maybe he wants, you know, you could say, hey, it's the free market, people are buying these things, whatever, let them do it. But actually the reason that he latches onto this is because he sees some sort of moral problem with it, and that starts to get the wheels turning. So yeah. You have this thing for, you know, for a while, you know, players and gamers were fine with it because there was no actual advantage. Once you give them advantages in-game, for whatever reason, whatever, that's the problem, wakes them up to it. And once the outrage from that gets loud enough, now all of a sudden politicians are paying attention. And it's not just because I want gamers to be playing equal in Call of Duty, it's because, well, gosh, damn, I don't want, you know, an 11-year-old kid hopping into a game and, you know, like the stories that we hear all the time, burning down their father's credit or whatever, the mother's credit.
Yeah. And the companies usually sort of pivot and they defend themselves by saying, yeah, but we have parental controls and we have, you know, things that we can put in place that limit the spending of you know, X, Y, and Z. But there is still like a really shady, in my opinion, shady, like, you know, predatory practice and play here where, I mean, yeah, you can make the, like you said, you can make the moral argument of like, but what about the kids? But it's also like, but what about like humans who are susceptible to this kind of, you know, this trick, this trap? And like an EA representative said something along the lines of like, yeah, but they're like, you know, they're fun and they're surprises, like Kinder eggs or whatever. And you're like, not really. I mean, it's a thing that, I mean, in my opinion, it's a completely different beast. And once you have your credit card, you know, saved, your credit card information saved to a specific service or whatever the case may be, it's really easy to just like continue to add and add stuff to your cart or whatever.
But people are realizing that more now. They're realizing, you know, even 3 years ago, the discussions on this were very limited, and now they're realizing what it is. And I think really, I mean, the tide is turning insofar as regulation and, you know, some smaller, you know, companies deciding, actually, we're going to go with an in-game cosmetic store model or whatever. And I think it's important to note that we're not going to see major change necessarily, but what we might see is once it becomes clear to companies that there's not as much of an advantage to actually having these models, we're going to see them change. This is why we saw big DLC packs go into smaller things. This is why horse armor cost like $20, and now DLC doesn't really cost that much anymore. It's because they realize that there's actually other pathways to get the money that they want. And that sucks, right? It sucks to think of the economics of these things. And especially it sucks because, so many things are games as service, and you have these long-term games that really need to have a revenue stream, or else, well, what the hell are you going to do? You can't have your Destiny servers on forever, right? Like, crap, we have to, Destiny's not as bad about this as other things, but you can't keep Overwatch or whatever, all these things running forever. So we have to find models that actually sustain our product. And you can't really do that because you're not making single player games anymore. You're making these long-term commitments. And I think it's never going to go away, I don't think, unless there's strict laws against it, which honestly, I'm sorry to say, people, I'm in favor of, right? I think people balk at the idea of regulation. In this case, I'm for it. But I think once companies start to see that there's a sentiment against these systems, once they start to see, if it does happen, that these things don't have as much return as they used to, then things start to change. It's not just a matter of disclosing odds, but if, once people see these odds and they go, well, crap, I can't get this really good Fire Emblem hero character because it's going to take me so much money theoretically. Once they realize that it has these diminishing returns, that it costs them so much, if companies start to see a downturn in their usage of loot boxes or other monetization schemes, then they adopt something else. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this whole process has been, one of the things that kicked it off was just outrage, right? And sometimes at the very least, outrage can be good because it's focused on something that's actually harmful, right? There's a difference between getting mad about predatory business models and there's another difference about being like, oh, they delayed the game 2 months, like we hate them, or like, all the stuff that happened with No Man's Sky or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's an appreciable difference because this is something that really affects people materially and monetarily, and like you can see the actual harm to it. And so now that outrage needs to turn into broader consumer action, at least insofar as, right, don't support it.
Right.
And that's such an easy thing to say because they are hard things to avoid. Like, I have gacha games on my phone. I'm freaking sorry. I like those games. I like the game aspects of them. But, you can't just be angry. You can, but what you need to do is you need to take the energy of that anger and turn it into something. So if people aren't buying these things and we see that tide turning slowly every bit by bit, then companies are going to go, well, these things aren't worth our time. And they'll make, more limited time Fortnite stores where you have 24 hours to buy a really cool skin or whatever the hell. And that sucks too, but at least it'll be different to a certain extent. It won't be scientists figuring out, or like artists and animators figuring out the perfect animation to get your lizard brain going. Yeah. It'll be something hopefully better, or at least not as super screwed up.